The city pulsed around him, the rhythmic thrum of traffic, the occasional distant laughter, the scent of rain clinging to the cool night air. Ethan Mercer moved through this world with precision, always in control. He never second-guessed a decision. He had built an empire on calculated risks, never allowing distractions to throw him off course. Yet here he was, standing on the edge of a grimy sidewalk, staring at a woman who shouldn't have caught his attention. She sat slouched against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront, her arms lazily crossed, one leg stretched out, the other bent at the knee. Her clothes were worn, her hair wild from the wind, but her posture held none of the exhaustion he expected. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't clinging to the world's mercy. She was waiting. Ethan never stopped for strangers. He had no interest in lost causes. But something about the way she carried herself, detached, untouchable, as if she didn't belong here any more than he did, made him pause. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crisp bills, stepping into her shadow. A test. Need money? His voice was even, devoid of sympathy. She didn't jump at the offer like most would. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, barely looking at the cash. Then she looked up at him. And Ethan felt it, that shift in the air. Sharp eyes. Too sharp. Not pleading. Not desperate. Assessing. Her lips curled, not in gratitude, but in amusement. That depends. Ethan frowned slightly. On what? She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall like she had all the time in the world. On whether this is some kind of social experiment, the rich man looking for a moral lesson, seeing if the poor girl reacts the way he expects. Something flickered in him. Irritation, curiosity, something he couldn't quite place. You think I care that much? He countered. She let out a quiet chuckle. I think men like you do everything for a reason. Ethan wasn't used to being read so easily. Most people tried to impress him, tried to win his favor. She didn't even bother, and for some reason that intrigued him. He crouched slightly, meeting her gaze, his voice dropping lower. How about this? You come with me to an event. Pretend you belong. Smile at the right people. And in return, I'll pay you enough to walk away from all this. She finally moved, rolling her shoulders before looking him over, really looking this time. Enough to change my life? Enough to make you disappear from this one, he replied. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. It was gone in an instant, but Ethan caught it. A flicker of something. Recognition. Then, just as quickly, she smirked again. But it was different now. Less amusement, more curiosity. She moved slowly, pushing herself to her feet. There was something unnatural about it, not in a clumsy way, but in a way that suggested she wasn't used to being in this position. On the ground, at the mercy of anyone. Now, standing in front of him, the differences were more striking. Her posture was too poised, her shoulders too straight. She didn't stand like someone who had spent years on the street. She stood like someone who had once been something else. Something more. What's the catch? She asked, crossing her arms. Ethan shrugged. No catch. You just have to play along. She held his gaze, and for a moment it was uncomfortable. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because he felt like she was peeling him apart, piece by piece, dissecting his motives before even considering his offer. Then, finally, she sighed. All right, she said. Like she was doing him a favor. Ethan should have felt victorious. But as she stepped past him, her chin slightly raised, walking like someone who already knew the rules of this world, his gut twisted. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who had just won. The sleek black car pulled up in front of Valmont and Company, an exclusive high-end salon where only the city's elite set foot. The kind of place where the scent of wealth was woven into the very air, where whispers of power and influence echoed through marble hallways. Ethan stepped out first, buttoning his coat with practiced ease, but as he turned toward the passenger side, Lena hadn't moved. She sat inside, her gaze fixed on the building ahead, fingers tapping against the leather seat. Not nervously, not hesitantly, just thinking. He frowned. What? She looked at him then, head tilting slightly, an almost lazy smirk playing at her lips. This is the part where you make me look the part, isn't it? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. With a small exhale, she finally stepped out of the car, the streetlight catching the sharp angles of her face, the way her eyes flickered with something unreadable. She adjusted the hem of her worn-out sweater, then stuffed her hands into her pockets. Unbothered. Detached. As if she were walking into a convenience store, not a place where a single haircut cost more than what most people made in a month. Inside, the moment they stepped through the doors, the energy shifted. Ethan was used to being recognized, respected, catered to, but all eyes weren't on him. They were on her. The head stylist, a polished woman in a fitted dress, pursed her lips as she eyed Lena. The other attendants whispered, barely disguising their intrigue. Lena should have looked out of place. She should have been intimidated. Instead, she met their stares with a single raised eyebrow, daring them to say something. Ethan smirked. This woman. He turned to the stylist. I want a complete transformation. Hair, makeup, wardrobe, everything. The stylist nodded, but her gaze lingered on Lena, as if trying to piece something together. Lena, on the other hand, exhaled a slow, almost bored sigh. So dramatic, she muttered under her breath, but Ethan caught it. She was enjoying this. The hours pass. Ethan waited. He wasn't sure why he was still here. Normally he would have left, let the staff do their work, returned only when the job was done. But something about this transformation felt different. It wasn't just about dressing up some stranger to fit into his world. It was about revealing who she really was. And Ethan had a feeling she knew that too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors to the styling room opened. The room hushed. And there she was. Lena stood beneath the glow of the chandelier, her once tangled hair now sleek and cascading in soft, deliberate waves. Her skin, once dulled by exhaustion, now looked flawless, elegant, untouchable. The fitted black dress clung to her frame, simple but striking, sculpted in a way that demanded attention. She walked forward slowly, heels clicking against marble, her gaze drifting across the room with the same unreadable expression as before. No hesitation, no wide-eyed shock, no awe, nothing. And that's what bothered him. Ethan had seen this transformation 100 times before, people drowning in borrowed confidence, too aware of their own reflection. But Lena, she didn't even flinch. She didn't admire herself in the mirror, didn't smile in delight at the change. She simply looked, observed, as if she had already seen herself like this before. And suddenly, Ethan realized, she wasn't transforming into someone new. She was becoming who she had been all along. Not bad, she murmured, finally meeting his gaze. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. This wasn't an act. She had been in this world before, and she was about to step back into it like she never left. The night was extravagant. Golden chandeliers dripped light over an opulent ballroom filled with the city's elite. Women draped in designer gowns clinked crystal glasses, their laughter practiced, their smiles rehearsed. Men adjusted cufflinks worth more than most people's salaries, discussing business deals between sips of expensive scotch. It was the kind of event where power wasn't just flaunted, it was worshipped. Ethan didn't care for any of it. But tonight, he had a purpose. As the doors to the grand venue swung open, a silence rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Murmurs followed, the whispers barely concealed behind champagne flutes. Ethan had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Lena moved beside him, her steps effortless, the black silk of her gown flowing around her like liquid night. There was something about her presence, something unnerving. She didn't belong here. And yet she walked as though she owned the very air these people breathed. The men noticed her first. The subtle tilt of their heads, the quick glance before their gazes lingered a second too long. Then came the women, their painted smiles faltering for the briefest moment, their carefully curated confidence wavering. Because who was she? And more importantly, why was she here? Sophie notices. Across the ballroom, Sophie Vaughn stood frozen, champagne glass halfway to her lips. The bride, the woman who had once held Ethan's future in her hands before crushing it. Tonight she was draped in white silk, the image of a perfect bride, surrounded by admirers. Yet in this moment, all of that faded into irrelevance. Her eyes locked onto Lena. Sophie recovered quickly, but Ethan caught it. The barely there flicker of surprise, the way her shoulders tensed for just a second before she forced a polite smile. Then, she did what she always did. She played the part. She glided toward them with the ease of someone who had never known insecurity, her practiced smile still in place. But her eyes betrayed her. "Ethan," she greeted, her voice perfectly neutral, perfectly pleasant. "I didn't expect you to come." Ethan smiled, cold, calculated. "Of course I came." He glanced at Lena, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "And I brought company." Sophie's gaze snapped to Lena, assessing, calculating. The moment stretched just long enough to confirm Ethan's suspicions. She wasn't just looking, she was searching. Who is she? Where have I seen her before? Why does she feel familiar? Lena, as always, remained unreadable. The silence between them stretched a beat too long. Then, Sophie smiled again, too controlled. "You haven't introduced us," she said smoothly. Before Ethan could respond, Lena stepped forward. She extended her hand, a perfectly poised smile curving her lips. Unshaken. Untouchable. "Lena," she said simply, her voice smooth as silk. "It's a pleasure." Sophie hesitated, for just a second. Then she shook Lena's hand, though her grip was slightly too firm, as if she were trying to regain control. "You look familiar," Sophie mused, tilting her head. "Have we met before?" Lena didn't blink. "Do I?" Sophie's polite smile faltered, so brief it would have gone unnoticed to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Ethan saw it. She wasn't just curious. She was trying to place a memory. "The game begins." Lena tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "This is a beautiful wedding." A deliberate change of subject. A test. Would Sophie take the bait or push further? Sophie hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered, her expression smoothing over. "Thank you. We put a lot of thought into making everything perfect." Lena let out a soft hum, trailing her fingers along the stem of her champagne glass. "Perfection is an illusion, don't you think?" A subtle challenge. Sophie's nails tightened around her own glass. Barely, but Ethan noticed. And he knew. Sophie was rattled. She didn't know why. Not yet. But she would. And when she did, it would already be too late. The ballroom glittered under the glow of the grand chandelier, its golden light casting a dreamlike haze over the elegant guests swirling across the dance floor. It was the kind of world built on appearances, where power was measured by the weight of a name and the depth of a bank account. Ethan knew it well. But tonight he was watching someone who didn't just fit in. She was unsettlingly effortless. Lena moved through the crowd, like she had done this 100 times before, brushing off conversation with a practiced smile, dodging questions with the grace of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate curiosity. Yet, it wasn't just that she blended in. It was the way she carried herself. She wasn't dazzled by the wealth, wasn't intimidated by the names that held power in this city. She wasn't just playing a role, she was reclaiming something. And Ethan didn't like what that implied. When Ethan extended his hand to her, she didn't hesitate. The moment their fingers met, he felt it. Something unspoken, something dangerous. He led her onto the dance floor, his grip firm, guiding her with an ease he knew should be impossible. But Lena didn't stumble. She didn't falter. She moved like someone who had danced in ballrooms like this before. Ethan's voice was low, nearly lost beneath the melody of the orchestra. "You're surprisingly good at this." A soft laugh, barely audible. "Surprising?" she mused. "Or inconvenient?" His grip tightened, just slightly. She noticed. Of course she did. "I thought you were someone trying to escape this world," he murmured. She lifted her chin slightly, her smirk infuriatingly unreadable. "And what if I wasn't escaping?" Something flickered in his chest. Something he didn't like. Lena leaned in just enough for her lips to brush against his ear, her voice barely a whisper. "What if I was taking it back?" And just like that, Ethan knew. Lena wasn't just someone he had picked off the streets. She was someone who had been here before. Someone who had lost something. Someone who had every intention of getting it back. The music shifted, and as Ethan twirled her gracefully, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. A man. Watching them. Not just watching. Studying. Benjamin Cole. One of the city's most powerful businessmen, a name that commanded rather than requested. The kind of man who had built empires on other people's mistakes. A man who never wasted his time on things that didn't matter. Yet, his gaze was locked on Lena. Not with interest, not with attraction, with recognition. Lena's fingers tensed slightly against Ethan's. She had seen him too, but she didn't react the way most people would. She didn't panic. She prepared. Ethan turned back to her, his mind already racing. "Who is he to you?" Lena's smirk returned, but this time, there was something behind it. Not amusement, a warning. "Careful, Ethan," she whispered, her tone feather-light but sharp enough to cut. "You might not like what you find." By the time the dance ended, Ethan already knew what he was going to do. The pieces weren't lining up. Nothing about Lena made sense. And if there was one thing Ethan hated, it was being played. So he would find out the truth. Who she was, where she came from, and most importantly, what the hell she was really after. As he led her off the dance floor, his fingers barely brushing against hers, one thing became painfully clear. Lena wasn't just a woman from the streets. She was a storm. And Ethan was standing right in the center of it. The wedding had been perfect. At least that's what the headlines would say. The social elite would marvel at the extravagance, the carefully curated floral arrangements, the way Sophie Vaughn had once again solidified her place as a queen among them. They would admire the way she carried herself, the poised, untouchable woman who always seemed to be 5 steps ahead. But Sophie didn't feel ahead. She felt cornered. The moment she had spotted Lena, something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just irritation. It was something deeper, something colder. a whisper from a past she had long since buried. Standing in front of the grand vanity mirror in her bridal suite, still wrapped in her pristine white gown, Sophie traced the rim of her wine glass with one manicured nail. Her reflection was as flawless as ever, but the sharp edge in her gaze betrayed her unease. She replayed every interaction in her mind, every word exchanged, every glance Lena had given her, every calculated smirk. She knows something. Sophie prided herself on instinct. She had learned from the best, her father, a man who had taught her that power wasn't just about wealth. It was about knowing things others didn't. And tonight, her instincts screamed at her that Lena was more than just a pretty face by Ethan's side. She took another sip of wine, her grip tightening around the glass. If she was going to maintain control, she needed answers. With a smooth movement, she reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "I need you to look into someone," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. A pause, then a deep chuckle from the other end. "The wedding night barely over and you're already plotting, Sophie. Some things never change." She wasn't in the mood for amusement. "This is serious." Another pause, then interest. "What's the name?" Sophie hesitated for the briefest moment. "Lena." "Lena what?" She exhaled, her jaw tightening. "That's what I need you to find out." Meanwhile, Ethan digs deeper. Ethan wasn't the type to second-guess himself. He built his empire on logic, on certainty, on control. But Lena had thrown all of that into chaos. From the moment she had met his gaze on the street, with those sharp eyes and that smirk that dared him to look deeper, something about her had felt off. Not in a way that repelled him, but in a way that unraveled him. He had to know. The moment they left the wedding, he made the call. "I need a background check." The voice on the other end scoffed. "Since when do you care about the background of the women you spend time with?" Ethan's fingers drummed against his desk. This one is different. His private investigator, a man who knew how to unearth every secret, every hidden truth, got to work immediately. Hours passed. Ethan paced. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was just about getting ahead of a situation that had begun to feel beyond his control. But the moment the first report came in, he realized this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. The document sat in front of him, the weight of its words pressing against his chest like a lead brick. Lena Carlisle didn't exist. She had no record, no history, no paper trail. But Lena Davenport did. Ethan's breath came slow and measured as he scanned the details. Christopher and Eleanor Davenport. A name that once carried influence, wealth, and old money prestige. A family that had once stood beside Sophie Vaughan's, until it all collapsed. Until Sophie's father made sure of it. Ethan read through the report again, his mind piecing together the fragments of a story that had been erased from public memory. Lena's father had been a business mogul, respected, feared, admired. He had built an empire on strategic investments, on deals that had shaped industries. He had power. And then, he lost everything. Ethan traced the timeline with his eyes, noting how quickly it had happened. One bad deal, a hostile takeover, a scandal that had sent the Davenport name into oblivion. And at the center of it all, Sophie Vaughan's father. Lena's true intentions. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, piecing it all together. Lena hadn't stumbled into his life by accident. She hadn't just been some woman on the street looking for a lucky break. She had planned this. She had been waiting. And now, Ethan knew the most dangerous truth of all. She wasn't here to play the game. She was here to burn the whole thing to the ground. The choice Ethan's jaw tightened as he shut the folder, the weight of his next move pressing heavily against him. Sophie was already digging, and if she found out the truth first, Lena wouldn't have time to make her next move. But Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to stop her, because deep down, something dark and thrilling coiled in his chest. He wanted to see what she would do next. And worse, he wasn't sure which side he'd be on when she did. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The dim lighting of Ethan's penthouse cast sharp shadows across the space, making everything feel colder, heavier. A file lay open on the glass coffee table between them, its contents spilling out, fragments of a life that was never meant to be uncovered. Ethan stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. His pulse was a dull roar in his ears, drowning out everything else. He had been played. "You used me," he finally said, his voice dangerously low. The words carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. Across from him, Lena, or rather Isabel Devereaux, remained poised, her posture unshaken. If she felt guilt, she didn't show it. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes steady and unreadable. "I did what I had to do." Ethan exhaled sharply, a humorless laugh escaping him. The audacity, the sheer nerve of her to stand there so composed, as if this wasn't a betrayal of every thread of trust he had reluctantly woven between them. "This was never about me," he said, more to himself than to her. It was always about her. Sophie. A flicker of something crossed her face. Acknowledgement, maybe. She didn't deny it. Ethan grabbed the file, flipping through the pages, the evidence stark and damning. A legacy erased, a family destroyed, a betrayal hidden behind wealth and power. And at the center of it, the Vaughn family. Sophie's family. "You planned this," he continued, his voice sharp, accusing. "From the very beginning." Lena finally moved, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She stopped near the window, her gaze fixed on the city below, the empire that once belonged to her family. "I waited," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "For years, I watched. I listened. I learned exactly how this world worked, and I knew one day I'd get my chance." Ethan's grip tightened around the folder. "And you used me to get there." Lena turned then, finally facing him. The light from the window cast shadows along her features, making her look almost haunting. Beautiful. Dangerous. Unbreakable. "You're angry," she observed. "You feel betrayed." Ethan let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "I should have known. From the moment I met you, you weren't desperate. You weren't scared. You walked into my world like you belonged there. And now I know why." Lena didn't flinch. "I was never meant to be on the outside looking in. Sophie made sure of that. She and her family destroyed mine, left us to rot, and then went on like nothing had happened. Like we never mattered." Her voice was calm, but Ethan heard the undertone of something deeper. Rage. Pain. The weight of years spent in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then he realized something that sent a chill down his spine. "This wasn't about revenge," he said slowly, piecing it together. "This was about reclaiming what was yours." Lena's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Now you're starting to understand." The truth settled between them like a final move on a chessboard. She hadn't come to destroy Sophie. She had come to take back what had been stolen. And Ethan, he had unknowingly handed her the key to do it. He should have been furious. He should have walked away. But instead he found himself asking the one question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. Was any of it real? For the first time that night, Lena hesitated. It was barely noticeable. A flicker of something in her gaze, a breath she held for half a second too long. And then, just like that, the mask was back. "You'll have to decide that for yourself." Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had spent years playing the game, manipulating, controlling, always being the one to call the shots. But this time, he wasn't sure if he had been the player or the played. The storm had been brewing for weeks, and tonight, it was finally time to let it break. The Harrington Charity Gala was the kind of event where fortunes were solidified, alliances were forged, and power was measured by the number of zeros in your bank account. The elite of the elite gathered beneath the shimmering glow of crystal chandeliers, exchanging polite smiles as they sized each other up like predators in designer suits. But tonight, the power wasn't where they thought it was. Tonight, it belonged to Lena. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, draped in an emerald gown that shimmered like a blade in the candlelight. Ethan was beside her, his presence as commanding as ever, his gaze locked onto the crowd below. Somewhere in that sea of wealth and arrogance stood Sophie Vaughn, the woman who had stolen everything from Lena's family. And tonight, she was about to lose it all. Sophie had been waiting for this. She wasn't stupid. She had seen the signs, the way Ethan was suddenly always at Lena's side, the whispers that followed them at every event. She had felt the shift in the air, the way the city's elite had started questioning, wondering. And Sophie Vaughn did not tolerate threats. That was why, even as she stood at the center of the gala, perfectly poised in a sleek silver gown, she was already playing her hand. She had called in every favor, every connection, every journalist who owed her a debt. The headlines were already drafted. Lena Carlisle exposed. A fraud. A manipulator. A woman who had latched on to Ethan Mercer like a parasite, fooling him into believing she was something more than a nobody. Sophie had spent years erasing Lena Davenport from existence, and now she was going to make sure that Lena Carlisle didn't survive either. With a satisfied smile, she lifted her champagne flute to her lips. It was over. Except, it wasn't. A sudden hush rippled through the crowd. The murmurs started small, but they spread like fire. Sophie turned, irritation flickering across her perfectly composed face. Something was happening. And then she saw them. Ethan and Lena. Standing at the center of the grand hall, the weight of every single gaze locked onto them. Sophie's stomach twisted. Ethan held a microphone in one hand and a folder in the other. Thick with documents, thick with proof. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not her, not here. The moment Ethan spoke, the world as she knew it started to crumble. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was calm, smooth, lethal. "I think it's time we talk about the truth." The screens around the room flickered to life. Images, documents, signatures. And then, video evidence. A recording of Sophie's father, laughing over brandy, discussing how easy it had been to set up Christopher Davenport, how they had planted false evidence of financial fraud, how they had crushed him before he even saw it coming, how Sophie herself had helped orchestrate every step. A gasp tore through the crowd. Someone dropped their glass. Sophie's mask cracked, visibly, publicly. "You think you can do this to me?" Her voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "You think anyone will believe? It's already been sent to every major news outlet in the city," Lena cut in. For the first time in her life, Sophie Vaughn looked afraid. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her composure unraveling by the second. "You think anyone will care? You think they'll turn against me?" Ethan stepped closer. They already have. Around them, the crowd had shifted, no longer admiring, no longer loyal. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were verdicts, Sophie Vaughn, the queen of high society, was now a disgraced liar, a fraud, a woman whose empire had been built on the bones of the people she had destroyed. And now? It was her turn to fall. Security was already stepping forward. She had no allies left, no favors to call in, no way to stop what was happening. Lena tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice almost soft. "And now, you finally know what that feels like." Sophie opened her mouth, to argue, to deny, to beg, but no one was listening anymore. The night ended in chaos. Headlines exploded across the city, unraveling Sophie Vaughn's name faster than she could attempt to salvage it. Her family's empire was in shambles. Her father's old crimes dragged back into the light. The people who once praised her turned their backs. And Lena? She walked away without looking back. For the first time in years, she was free. But as she and Ethan stepped out into the cool night air, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You won," he said. Lena inhaled deeply, staring up at the city skyline, the weight of everything finally lifting. "No," she murmured. "I took back what was mine." And with that she walked away, head high, untouchable, unstoppable. The storm had come and gone, and Lena Davenport had survived. The headlines told the story best. Sophie Vaughn arrested for financial fraud. Her empire crumbles overnight. Photographs plastered every news channel. Sophie, once the queen of high society, now a disgraced woman in handcuffs, her flawless mask shattered for the world to see. Her desperate attempts to salvage what remained of her legacy had been futile. Every ally had turned their back. Every favor had dried up. The courts wasted no time. With the evidence Ethan and Lena had gathered, the verdict was swift. Decades of deception unraveled in a matter of days. And just like that, Sophie Vaughn was finished. Lena's justice standing in the courtroom as Sophie was sentenced, Lena felt nothing but quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not gloating, just the simple, unshakable peace of justice finally being served. For years, she had carried the weight of her past, the betrayal, the humiliation, the loss. It had shaped her, hardened her, but it had never broken her. Now, watching Sophie be led away, she finally felt something she hadn't in a long time. Freedom. No longer a woman on the run, no longer living in the shadows of what was taken from her. She had won. And this time, no one could take it away. The days passed in a blur of court hearings, media frenzies, and whispered conversations in the city's most powerful circles. But through it all, Ethan found himself watching Lena. She had done what she came to do. She had reclaimed her name, her dignity, her power. And now, she was leaving. He should have expected it. Lena had never been the type to stay in one place for too long. But the thought of her disappearing from his life? Unacceptable. For the first time in his life, Ethan Mercer, the man who had built an empire on control, who never let anyone get too close, was afraid. Because he knew now. He had fallen in love with her. Not just for her fire, her sharp tongue, her refusal to bow to anyone, but for who she was beneath it all. For the woman who had survived, who had rebuilt herself from the ashes, who had taught him that life was more than just power and strategy. And he wasn't about to let her go. It was late when he found her. Lena stood on the balcony of her new apartment, staring out at the city skyline, finally at peace. She had spent so long fighting. Now she could finally breathe. The sound of footsteps made her turn. "Ethan." She raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd be the type to drop by unannounced?" Ethan didn't smirk, didn't deflect. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lena froze. The city lights flickered behind him, the air between them charged with something deeper, something undeniable. He opened the box, revealing a ring, sleek, elegant, powerful, just like her. "I'm not the kind of man who asks twice," Ethan said, voice steady. "But for you I will." Lena inhaled sharply, her heart pounding against her ribs. For so long she had told herself she didn't need anyone. That love was a distraction, a weakness. But Ethan had been there, through every step of her battle, through every lie uncovered, every enemy taken down. He had fought beside her, not for her, but with her. And somehow, without her realizing it, he had become part of her story. She exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time in years, she let herself say yes. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his lips curving into a rare, genuine smile. And as he pulled her in for a kiss, Lena knew. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something far, far greater.